Larry Pratt's latest book is now available. On the Firing Line, Essays in the Defense of Liberty can be purchased from Gun Owners of America for only $18 plus shipping and handling. On the Firing Line is a collection of essays that GOA's Executive Director Larry Pratt has written over the last few years. They were composed in the battle to defend the right to keep and bear arms, as well as the rest of our liberties protected in the Bill of Rights. Pratt has taken on the arguments used by the enemies of freedom who would disarm and subjugate Americans. Pratt shows that the debate transcends firearms because the debate is really about control. Who will control the lives of private citizens? Will it be each person individually, or will it be the government? You can order your copy of On the Firing Line by going to the GOA website at gunowners.org, or you can call GOA's toll-free number 1-888-886-GUNS. That's 888-886-GUNS.
This is the Gun Owners News Hour, with the latest news about threats to your liberty and your right to keep and bear arms. Our host is Larry Pratt, Executive Director of Gun Owners of America. Our guests include elected and other public officials, journalists, citizen activists, and others who are fighting for the Bill of Rights, especially the Second Amendment. The Gun Owners News Hour covers a broad range of constitutional issues, particularly the debate over private ownership of firearms. Remember, the issue is not just about gun control, it's about control.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the News Hour. Today we want to talk about control, all right, and the freedom that comes in the absence of government controlling the minutiae of our daily lives. One word for that absence we call capitalism, otherwise known as freedom, otherwise known as an individual initiative. And a good friend of mine and of Gun Owners of America, Austin Hill, has written The Virtues of Capitalism, a moral case for free markets. And as I read the book, it was clear that it's not just about free markets, and Austin would be the first to make that point. It's about freedom. Freedom is what has produced the engine of economic success that has been so typical of the United States throughout our history, and that which is in such danger of becoming the goose that laid the golden egg, but not after it got its head cut off. Austin, really appreciate you. Also, thanks for having me on your radio program out there in the great state of Idaho from time to time, where you hold forth in a beautiful part of the country.
Well, thank you for that compliment. And Larry, it's an honor to be with you and your listeners. I appreciate your availability on my daily talk show in the state of Idaho. And we love to have Larry Pratt in Idaho every chance we get. So thank you for having me with you today on your program.
Well, you've done something very important. The Virtues of Capitalism is a book that certainly would be one that homeschoolers and people in private schools could use to great effect, because while it's not written as a textbook, it actually does lay out some of the very fundamental principles of free market economics. And I appreciated the way you began toward the beginning, addressing the people that can be viewed as or called faith voters, who think that just about abortion or marriage or things like that, and for that matter, we could probably expand that a bit to somebody that thinks it's, as long as the government stays away from my guns, I don't have anything to worry about. But as I think we will see, to ignore the economic issues is to end up giving the government all too much room to run around and do great mischief, and then the guns become a lot more important, even probably as we're less able to afford them.
Stay tuned for more of the Gun Owners News Hour, the program that bears the raw truth about the battle over who controls the guns, the people or the government. Now, more news about the threats to your liberties and your right to keep and bear arms. This is the Gun Owners News Hour. And here once again is your host, Executive Director of Gun Owners of America, Larry Pratt.
Thanks again for being with us. Today I'm speaking with Austin Hill. He is the author of The Virtues of Capitalism. Evidently he has enough time to write books in between hosting his daily talk show. And You're certainly making good use of your time, my friend. Let's take a look at the notion that, capitalism obviously needs a little help. George Bush thought it did. He said that he had to, something to the effect of, abandon his principles of free markets in order to save capitalism with government intervention. That's not word for word, but that was the essence of what he was saying. And in part, he was referring to the global financial mess. Surely that shows that capitalism can't be left to itself, right?
Well, there are those who would assume that, Larry, and you're correct. It was our former commander-in-chief, who I miss, by the way, in error as he was at times. I still miss the days of President George W. Bush, but
ditto
compared to where we're at today. But he did have that famous statement back in 2008, and a lot of people don't remember this, I realize, but in the midst of the 2008 presidential election with a stock market that crashed, it was President George W. Bush who first opened up the floodgates of federal money being funneled into General Motors and all kinds of federal banks to try to stave off the complete collapse of these institutions. And he did make that rather bizarre statement. He said, "I've abandoned my free market principles to save the free market system." What I think we've all seen since that time is that, for one thing, we really have no idea where our tax dollars have gone over the last couple of years. And Larry, you and I have talked about this over the last 3 years or so. We've seen little bits of information trickle out from the U.S. Department of the Treasury that says, oh, and by the way, the Treasury funneled money to foreign banks. And, oh, they handed off a few million to prop up this lending institution. And what happens, it gets back to the C word that you were describing earlier, Larry, when these various institutions that are otherwise a part of our free market economy, when they receive, either as a loan or as a subsidy or whatever, when they receive, quote-unquote, free money from the government, there are strings attached, and the government has control over them. We've seen the government bailout of General Motors. Even just this last week, we saw news headlines that we, the people of the United States, we've lost about $10 billion on that deal. But guess who benefited? Well, in some cases, I guess we'd have to say AFL-CIO unionized auto workers benefited, and they are politically beneficial, have been, to President Barack Obama. When we allow the government to step in and even in the name of doing great things and saving banks and propping up businesses and forestalling collapse and whatever, ultimately we are giving up control to politicians and unelected bureaucrats who will have their way with our lives. That's what's gone on, and that is a huge problem in our country right now.
You know, as we went into the 2008 elections, the Republican base was uneasy. John McCain wasn't very exciting. John McCain wasn't what they were looking for. John McCain is more comfortable schmoozing with Democrats and the Democrat media. And then when one of these financial crises erupted, John McCain suspended his campaign, as you well recall, and ran off to Washington. And for about a day, I thought, is he really going to do this right? Is he actually going to say this is nonsense? We've got to get the government out of this, or it's even going to get worse. It's not moral to take taxpayer money and give it to a bunch of folks in business that made bad decisions, regardless of why. Even if we can talk about how the government was very instrumental in setting up that bad environment, but the fact of the matter is they made the bad decisions. The capitalist system is they're supposed to live and lie in the bed they make. And I thought, man, maybe McCain is really going to stand for something. This is great, suspending the campaign. And then he comes out holding hands with Obama. That's
exactly what happened. You are correct. Senator John McCain. Go ahead.
I think that's where he lost the election.
I think you're absolutely right about that, Larry. That was clearly a turning point in the election cycle. But yes, presidential candidate John McCain and presidential candidate Barack Obama, they actually released a joint written statement saying, we believe, both of us, that the Congress needs to act to bail out these banks, lest there be a crisis in our economy.
The idea was all along, whether it was General Motors and Chrysler or the banks, that they were too big to fail, and it shows to me that neither one of those gentlemen, we know about Obama, we know he's a socialist, but the same with, frankly, George Bush and John McCain, do not understand that the business system has to live or die on the decisions it's made.
The Bill of Rights protects every American's God-given right to keep and bear arms. Now that right is being seriously undermined as legally registered rifles are being confiscated in some parts of our country. If we're not careful, we may find ourselves with no right to own guns, and that's where Gun Owners of America comes in. Gun Owners of America is in Washington every day fighting for you to keep that right. Congressman Ron Paul has called GOA the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington. You need to be part of this great grassroots group of activists who are keeping the heat on their members of Congress. Find out right now how you can join. Call 888-886-GUNS and get started receiving their fact-filled newsletters and action alerts. Call 888-886-GUNS or go to their webpage at gunowners.org and help make your voice heard in Washington. Make that call right now and call Gun Owners of America at 888-886-GUNS. Remember, it's not just about gun control, it's about control.
Now, more news about the threats to your liberties and your right to keep and bear arms. This is the Gun Owners News Hour. And here once again is your host, Executive Director of Gun Owners of America, Larry Pratt.
Back again with Austin Hill. Austin, I was just thinking about the title of your book, The Virtues of Capitalism, and I can hear it now. Somebody from George Bush all the way over to Karl Marx is going to say, what virtues?
Mm-hmm. Well, I will tell you, Larry, I've had this happen to me actually twice since the book has come out. So I've gone into bookstores and looked for the book on the shelf, knowing that they would not have it on the shelf. And I specifically picked out a couple of retailers that I know, would just shy away from this. And I go to the counter and I said, I wonder if you could check on a book and see if you can order it for me. And I say, the title is The Virtues of Capitalism. And twice now the clerk rolls her eyes and says, yeah, right, like there are any. People have this idea that capitalism is all based on greed. I'll tell you what, capitalism is based precisely on what you were describing earlier, Larry, and that is the liberty of the individual. I have sat in audiences where you were the keynote speaker. I've interviewed you, Larry, on in various talk radio venues, and you say it so succinctly that the right to keep and bear arms is essential to the liberty of the human individual. So also is the right to own private property essential to the liberty of the human individual. Now, oftentimes when we talk about property, we think about real estate. I bought a house or a commercial building or what have you. In economic terms, property means anything that can be used as the means of production or anything that can be used to make money. Maybe it's a home, maybe it's a computer, maybe it's your intellectual property, your created ideas. That said, the right to own those and do with them pretty much what you wish, that is essential to the liberty of the individual human person. It is essential to a free society. History bears it out when government controls the majority of the country's resources and does not allow private property rights, as it's known. Government becomes very, very abusive. And I think we're dangerously close to that scenario here in the U.S. today. But people have this idea that capitalism is all about greed. I'll tell you, greed, when somebody like Kim Jong-un or whoever's in charge these days in North Korea controls everything and lives in a palace while the people can't get enough water and food and electricity in their homes, that's government control, and that is greed unabated. And that's a huge, huge problem in our world today.
It seems to me that when I've seen greed in its ugliest form, it's in a dictatorial system. It's where the communists in the Soviet Union lived magnificently in the dachas that they had taken over from the wealthy during the Tsarist times, or the Cuban communists who live in the beautiful houses that were owned by the wealthy before Castro took over. And frankly, I haven't seen too many socialists in this country, certainly those in public life, that don't live rather grand themselves. They have retinues. They eat at the finest restaurants. The president is known to have a particular fondness for a kind of Japanese imported steak that's $100 a pound. I didn't even know they had meat that was even $20 a pound, let alone $100. In fact, when I learned about 20 years ago that Jesse Jackson, a socialist, wore suits that were in the neighborhood of $1,500, and that was 20 years ago, imagine what that would be today. It's still more than anything. It's in my closet by some measure. You realize that, these guys talk a great game about redistributing the wealth, but the redistribution seems to all go through their fingers.
Well, that's right, and the people's money gets redistributed to individuals and institutions of their choosing. Freedom is minimized, freedom is undermined in that process. And gosh, Larry, to your point, and with everything you're describing here, let's think about what we've learned just over the last week or so about the Internal Revenue Service. Here we've got 2 investigations going on simultaneously, if not more, looking at the high probability that the IRS was targeting for harassment religious Jewish groups, religious Christian groups, nonprofit groups, that is, and conservative political groups and educational groups, targeting them for harassment. And what were the IRS staffers doing? Well, they were living large over these last 3 or 4 years, taking extravagant, quote-unquote, seminar trips, hunkering down in ritzy hotels with paid entertainment, lavish food, and travel expenses and such, all at the expense of the taxpayer. The bottom line is, and again, I can't emphasize this enough, you say it so well, Larry, it gets back to, I'll call it the C word, control. When you can control other people's money, human nature is such that we can all become rather abusive and rather selfish. And that's why the capitalist system, when it's allowed to work, it works very, very well. If you have to do a day's work in order to receive a day's pay, well, you're incentivized to behave nicely. If you own your own private business and you have to treat customers properly so they'll come back, well, you're incentivized to treat customers properly. Whereas if you've just got government redistribution happening and you can just by force of law, sometimes figuratively, sometimes literally, with the force of a gun, confiscate people's wealth, you're not incentivized to treat them well at all. That's why I do believe the capitalist free market economic system is more virtuous, more moral, more good, if you will, than anything else on earth in terms of economic systems.
I remember one time going into an office and the clerk greeted me with these cheery words, "Yeah, what do you want?"
Yes, and?
You miserable person.
Right.
So it is about control, and that's what I love about the segue for the show where the announcer asks people to remember it's not just about gun control, it is about control. When we were a nation birthing, if that's a word, there was a system popular in the world, and I believe it was pretty much one of the big reasons for our war for independence. It's called mercantilism. And it worked just fine for the king and those that hung out with him, but it kind of was nasty for the rest of us, and I think that was what undergirded a whole lot of our unrest. I'm going to be back and talk some more about the virtues of capitalism.
The Bill of Rights protects every American's God-given right to keep and bear arms. Now that right is being seriously undermined as legally registered rifles are being confiscated in some parts of our country. If we're not careful, we may find ourselves with no right to own guns, and that's where Gun Owners of America comes in. Gun Owners of America is in Washington every day fighting for you to keep that right. Congressman Ron Paul has called GOA the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington. You need to be part of this great grassroots group of activists who are keeping the heat on their members of Congress. Find out right now how you can join. Call 888-886-GUNS and get started receiving their fact-filled newsletters and action alerts. Call 888-886-GUNS or go to their webpage at gunowners.org and help make your voice heard in Washington. Make that call right now and call Gun Owners of America at 888-886-GUNS. Remember, it's not just about gun control, it's about control.
More news about the threats to your liberties and your right to keep and bear arms. This is the Gun Owners News Hour. And here once again is your host, Executive Director of Gun Owners of America, Larry Pratt.
Back with Austin Hill, we're talking today about his book, The Virtues of Capitalism. And as the subtitle says, he's making a moral case for free markets. Doubly offensive of you to not only talk about the virtues of capitalism, but that there's even a moral case for capitalism. What?
There absolutely is a moral case for capitalism when you look at the reality of free market economics and what it has done to lift people out of poverty. Over the course of both yours and my lifetimes, Larry, we've seen the transformation of much of the Pacific Rim. We have seen some Latin American countries merge away from a socialist, in some cases, some people would argue even totalitarian governmental dynamic into one where things are privatized and private individuals and organizations can own and operate businesses and such. We've seen this transformation happen. It has not happened. Put it this way, Hong Kong or Singapore, neither one of them became economic epicenters because of government control and government management of the economy. China has not become a global economic superpower such that it is simply because they control all the nation's resources. Indeed, they've been moving in the westernized direction. They're not where we want them to be, but they have allowed for privatization of resources, and that's how they've produced wealth. When private individuals can control their own wealth and their own money and their own future and destiny, and they are held liable for their own choices, well, guess what? We, the people, private individuals, we generally are incentivized to make good choices. When government steps in and says, no, we're not going to let you be successful, or, oh, shoot, you slipped and fell, let us pick you up and cradle you and keep you comfortable. Either one of those scenarios, when government steps in and tries to control things, they don't produce good results. That is the difference. There absolutely is a moral case for free markets and capitalistic economic paradigms.
The Bible talks a lot about the virtues that are required for the operation of a successful capitalistic system for, if you prefer, for free markets. And I really appreciate the way you drew that out, that the Bible talks about individual responsibility. There is no place in the Bible whatsoever that talks about the government taking over for my family or for my church, which is where the Bible says charity, welfare, if you will, is to be operated, not the civil authorities whose real only responsibility is to kill bad guys and scare the rest of them to death.
Well, and I think, civil authority also has a proper purpose in that it applies the rules of the game, so to speak, sort of functions as a referee and applies them uniformly, not just targeting certain groups that are the political foes of the king or the president, but applies the rules uniformly. That said, your point, I think, is spot on. I do believe that the Holy Christian Scriptures, both the Old and New Testament, shed a lot of light on biblical wisdom or on economic wisdom. One of the things that we observe in the Scriptures is that, for one thing, when it comes to the care of the poor, certainly the Scriptures admonish us all to understand that the poor will always be with us. And I think spiritually, theologically, from a Judeo-Christian vantage point, one can say that the poor have a special place in God's heart, so to speak. And if you're a Christian or a Jew, your God commands you to care for the poor. But also, we see in the Scriptures that the poor are admonished whenever they are able-bodied and capable of doing so. They're supposed to participate in their own economic recovery. It's not a matter of simply having government take wealth away from one individual and give it to somebody that the government believes is poor. Or to put it in more, explicit Christian terms, Jesus commands me to grant a cup of cool water and food and necessities to a poor person. He doesn't say, vote for members of Congress who will take more and more out of your paycheck and give it to who they believe is deserving. Those are not the same thing. You are correct. Government welfare is absolutely not charity. But I fear that there's a lot of people in America who actually believe otherwise.
Yeah, the Good Samaritan didn't take the guy that had been whooped up on the road and robbed, didn't take him to some sort of a public almshouse. He took him to a place, to an inn, and paid out of his own pocket for the guy's welfare. And Mr. Innkeeper, if this isn't enough, now that I'm on my way again, when I come back, I'll settle up for any differences.
Yep.
That would horrify the average bureaucrat to think that that's what we were going to do to take care of those in need in our time. First of all, we wouldn't be taking care of a bunch of slugs. We would only be taking care of those in need, because when I'm giving out of my own pocket, that hurts.
Yeah, it does. It does. And it requires me to be willing to sacrifice. It requires a change in my character to give out of my own pocket, as you say, Larry. And that's quite a bit different than just having the government confiscate money, as I said, out of my bank account or my checking account or whatever. You know, take it before I ever see it, so I don't have to feel the pain of actually losing that money. Big difference, and I fear that not enough people of good faith, Christians, Jews, and others in America, don't understand that distinction. And certainly we have a regime in the White House and in Washington, D.C. that oftentimes likes to drape itself in religious language, as though somehow the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services or Obamacare is fulfilling Scripture. And I would say that it's just the opposite. And I believe now is our time. Now is our time for people of faith, especially in our country, to heed the clarion call, step up and say, no, we're not going to continue to allow the government to take more and more and more out of private bank accounts and away from private individuals. And we, the people, private individuals, charities, churches, synagogues, and such, we will step up and care for the poor among us. I think this is absolutely crucial.
It's crucial for the cause of freedom. If we continue to allow the government to grow a class of dependents, then you know what's going to happen. Dependents don't want to bother, at a minimum, providing for themselves really in any which way. And it is they who will vote against freedom and against the right to keep and bear arms, among many other of our freedoms. So the gun owner has a dog in this fight. We had better come alongside of those economic conservatives who are making the arguments that Austin Hill is making in The Virtues of Capitalism, and make sure that we return to a capitalistic system, because if you will look at the rest of the world, it is only in the United States, and I think you could probably still say Switzerland, and maybe the Baltic states now that they've been freed from the Soviet yoke, perhaps Czechoslovakia, where they've had some very forward-thinking leadership post-Soviet domination. These are the only places where you have economic freedom, where you have governments that really don't want, in fact, are trying to do away with as much of a dependency class as possible. And I don't know about the gun laws in these other countries, other than Switzerland, but it happens that this is where the right to keep and bear arms is recognized by the government, because the government doesn't, at least it hasn't had until perhaps sometime in the middle of the last century, the presumption that it had the legitimate authority to invade the private sphere in such a remarkable fashion, including taking on the gun owners. Switzerland still has a very vibrant Second Amendment, quote-unquote, culture, as do we. And frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if the gun laws are, well, they got to be a lot more relaxed than they were under the Soviets. But I just don't know about these other countries. But with their economic freedom, I wouldn't be surprised that there's a return to all kinds of personal freedom.
Well, I would hope so. And I would add to the list of countries that are moving in the correct direction, Larry, believe it or not, the country of Canada. During most of yours and my lifetimes, I believe it's probably safe to say, the U.S. has, for the most part, been leaning to the right, with some bumps in the road. Right. Canada, on the other hand, moving in a more socialistic, government-controlled sort of economic direction. Just the opposite is true today. Clearly, we are leaning to the left, although I have hope, and it is my prayer that we're starting to turn a circle, turn a corner, shall we say, in the U.S. Canada has absolutely been moving to the right. They have a prime minister and a majority in their parliament that has been privatizing and cutting the government sector and enhancing and thereby freeing up the private sector. They set quite an example for us.
Austin, I'm glad you mentioned Canada, because there is a parallel between an expansion of economic freedom and what we would call Second Amendment freedom. So when we get back from the break, I would like to start off by talking about the happy face that we can now put on our northern neighbor Canada has indeed been moving in the right direction in many fronts. We're going to be back and talk about the virtues of capitalism with Austin
Stay
Hill.
tuned for more of the Gun Owners News Hour, the program that bears the raw truth about the battle over who controls the guns, the people or the government.
Well, talking with Austin Hill about his book, The Virtues of Capitalism, and when we were heading into the last break, we had just made a mention of Canada. Well, it turns out that not only has Prime Minister Harper been moving the country in a free market direction, but among the things he's done to remove the government yoke is to do away with the country's handgun registry, which they had had for a gazillion years, since I think 1938. He pointed out that they didn't use it to solve crimes, just like we don't use any of the gun registry we have in our country to solve crimes. Funny thing, but most people that own a gun that happens to get registered are not the likely ones to commit a crime with them, and the gun that's used by a criminal was probably stolen from the guy that was forced to register his gun. So how's that working out? Well, in Canada, they were honest enough to say, this is stupid. This is a waste of a lot of money. And in the computer age, it's a very inviting target, as they were finding, for thieves to go crack into the system and find out who had multiple guns. So, hey, if you're going to rob guns, why not go to the guy that has 4 or 5?
Well, that's great news. See, I rely on you. I listen to what you say, Larry Pratt, as far as understanding what's going on in terms of our liberty to protect ourselves if we so choose with a firearm, and the liberty that other people in other parts of the world have. I follow the economic trends, and good for Prime Minister Stephen Harper of Canada, who apparently correlates those two probably almost well as you do, which it sounds like it anyway.
Yeah.
Look, these things are essential, and Canada drove itself to the brink, to the cliff, to the edge with government debt, with non-functioning economic systems, government waste, and that key word that you brought up a little while ago, Larry, dependency. And the electorate there, the people of the country, it's interesting, some of the critiques, I'm sure you've observed this yourself, Larry, but a lot of the critiques, op-eds and such in Canada about Prime Minister Stephen Harper, they'll kind of say, well, he's nerdy and he's just not all that likable, he's not very charming, but he's exactly what we need right now. And that seems to be the recurring narrative, if you will, of Prime Minister Harper. And I hope we can have nerdiness or a lack of charm notwithstanding. I hope we have somebody with his wisdom at the White House in the coming years.
Yeah, if I'm looking for a friend, I'll look for one in a church or something like that. But I really don't care about the guy's personality as the head of state, as long as his hand is not in my pocket. Then he can be very charming, and I'm still not going to think well of him.
Yes. Keep the hands out of the pocket, and don't you touch my holster either. How do you like that?
That's right, because it's there to protect the pocket.
Yes.
So don't even get close. You mentioned some of our evangelical brothers, and I hope Jim Wallace is truly one, but he's made some really stunning statements, like, God hates inequality. The great crisis of American democracy is the division of wealth. Wow, is that profoundly dangerous for a Christian spokesman to be talking like that?
I have taken Reverend Jim Wallace to task for those things. I've never met Mr. Wallace. He is, as far as I know, and I regard him as a devout evangelical Protestant Christian, and I believe he shares my Christian faith. I think he's horribly misguided on a whole bunch of things. For one thing, I don't see how I don't see anywhere in the scriptures where equality is cited as a problem. I'll use an example of this. Steve Nash. I used to live in Phoenix, Arizona. Steve Nash is still a relatively young man, in my view. Phenomenal pro basketball player, makes millions of dollars throwing a ball through a hoop and running up and down a court. No matter how much I practice, I will never play basketball like Steve Nash. Truthfully, I suspect no matter how much he practiced, Steve Nash will never write books, and think about things and do talk radio and all the things that I do, as well as I do. That is to say, there is inherent inequality in the created order. None of us are exactly the same. We are each, and our Constitution speaks to this, I believe, as well as does the Christian Scriptures. We are each uniquely endowed by our Creator. That is, by definition, inequality. No one individual is equal in terms of their gifting or their capacities or capabilities. What is equal, and what our U.S. Constitution seeks to ensure, is that we all have equal liberty. But this notion of inequality that many Christians, liberal and sometimes even theologically conservative Christians espouse, this is, I think, allowing oneself to be co-opted by the modern-day culture. It is not theologically rational, and it certainly doesn't mesh with the U.S. Constitution.
I was thinking of an example as you were making those remarks that, we don't all have the same kinds of gifts, nor do we have the same measure of those gifts, even if we arguably have, you and I have a gift of gab. We're both with our own talk show. Yours is a much bigger deal than mine. Rush Limbaugh is a much bigger deal than all of us. And, I don't sit around losing sleep because Rush Limbaugh makes a lot more money in a second with his mouth open than I do in a year. That's fine. Good for him.
And we all need to be able to do as you're doing, Larry. We need to be able to look to somebody who's, shall we say, higher up on the ladder than us and say, good for them. Instead of just looking down the ladder and saying, boy, I'm glad I'm not them. We need to understand our place in the world, to accept it, and if we choose to try to better our situation, well, thankfully, we're still free to do that. But this, I really think what you're getting at here is this pervasive sense of envy, jealousy, if you will, in our culture that says somebody else has more than me, and that's just not fair. We have a president and a lot of people in Congress who love to placate that sentiment. It is unhealthy. It is destructive to our culture, to our country, and frankly to humankind.
And, as you've pointed out in the book, fair is not defined by our having equal amounts of stuff. Fair applies to the rules of the game. Fair means that I have as good a shot as you do or Rush Limbaugh does, and if the outcomes are not equal, it's still fair.
I oftentimes analogize this to parents who refuse to keep score at their child's soccer game or any other sporting event. I have a son who's in high school, and he played little peewee sports when he was very young, and that just drove him batty when, we didn't keep score, and at the end of the season, everybody got a trophy. And even, as young as age 6 or 7, my son would look at me and say, what did I do to deserve this? I didn't earn this. It is implicit, I think, in the human soul that we want to achieve. We want to be recognized for those achievements. But a part of us, I believe, Larry, a part of our soul dies when we are just given things that we didn't earn, or when we have things taken from us that we did earn. And we need to begin to respect one another first and foremost, and then demand that our government respect us. That's where I think things are at in America right now.
And when politicians are making important economic decisions, they're not, as you've pointed out, this is not their money, so they really don't think about, am I going to be above water at the end of the day, at the end of the year? They're just thinking about how many votes they can get. And hence we've seen from George Bush, John McCain, and now in spades we've seen this incredibly reckless behavior of the current administration. And yet auto companies that got bailed out failed.
Right.
And other failures have been attendant, all this stuff. Austin, thanks so much. I knew we'd not have enough time, but we were talking about The Virtues of Capitalism by Austin Hill.
Our rights to keep and bear arms has never been under as much attack. And gun owners of America are fighting daily in Washington to protect that right. This program, the Gun Owners News Hour, keeps you up to date on that fight. GOA is the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington.